indicated he might arrive late for us to start without him, and Mr. Shepard is unable to be with us, so we're otherwise all here. I'm going to suggest again, for the benefit of the audience, if not ourselves, that we go around the table and identify ourselves. Mr. Zopti?
I don't think
they're on. I think we just need to bring them close to.
Bring them closer, okay.
Testing. Okay. Testing. My name is Roberto Sadate. I'm chairman of the board of the Alamo Community Colleges in San Antonio.
Woody Hunt. I'm formerly vice chairman of the UT Board of Regents and currently chair of the Governor's Business Council Higher Education Task Force. I'm from El Paso.
Bobby Ray from Plano, former chair of the University of North Texas.
Corinne Wildenthal, I'm president of UT Southwestern Medical Center for a few more months.
Bernie Francis, chair of the board, Texas State University System.
Whit Ryder, vice chair of the Higher Education Coordinating Board.
Raymond Paredes, commissioner of higher education.
Very good. And Mr. Roberts and Mr. Young are here from the governor's office to keep us straight. I will remind the group that we have really two charges, both of which need to be accomplished before July the 15th of this year. One is to make a recommendation about the deployment of the $100 million that has been appropriated but not allocated for fiscal year 2009. And secondly, to recommend to the legislature and the governor longer-term incentive funding plans that presumably might be considered in spring of 2009's legislative session for fiscal year 2010 and indefinitely beyond that. Before we start, I thought it might be useful just to go over some advice that we have received from our consultant, Dennis Jones, who was unable to be with us at this meeting but will be with us at a later meeting, and also the coordinating board committees that date from 1992, not with regard to their specific recommendations, but with regard to some general principles that each of those three presentations were uniform about. Dr. Jones pointed out that the current Texas funding formula provides strong incentives. Indeed, all formulas provide incentives, and that the current formula provides strong incentives for enrollment growth but not completion, and also it incentivizes mission creep. His recommendation was that a well-designed approach for incentive funded should be simple, with clear goals up front, with unambiguous measures of progress, fewer rather than more goals, and goals in which all sectors can legitimately participate. Dr. Roger Elliott described the General Academic Committee from 1992 and their emphasis on rewarding performance. They emphasized that it should be simple, that it should require a minimum level of bureaucracy, and that it should be determined by references to coordinating board databases that would require no additional data collection at the institutions as a practical matter. And the Health Committee said that the incentive funding should be based on outcomes, not on processes, should be quantifiable, easy to incorporate within a numerical formula, consistent and predictable. Again, the word that happens over and over is simple and easy to measure and balanced. And so I would like to just remind the committee and the audience that we have a difficult task ahead of us in order to please everybody, and probably an impossible task to please everybody. But experience shows that to the extent we can keep it simple, straightforward, and predictable, we might have more likelihood of success. The coordinating board, you'll recall, at the last meeting distributed a preliminary proposal that they were considering. Coordinating board has actually met since that time, and either Dr. Paredes or Mr. Ryder, do you want to describe to us where we stand on that?
Well, we're prepared to give a copy. Yesterday, the Strategic Planning Committee met and approved an incentive funding proposal pursuant to the rider. which covers only the academic institutions. And it does differ from the proposal which was submitted to the task force last meeting. There have been 2 adjustments made to it, and we're prepared to hand that out to the committee and discuss it with you today. And I will also just say, and we'll point this out, we also look at that in light of what we made, the recommendations we made for formula funding. We also covered that yesterday, and so we looked at it as a 2-tiered approach. One is we're making some substantial recommendations and changes for formula funding, and then on the second side, we're pairing our proposal up for incentive funding. So we'll discuss both those whenever you think it's appropriate, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. At the last meeting, we read but did not extensively discuss a thoughtful letter that Mr. Hunt had submitted. He was unable to be at the last meeting. And I see from the printed agenda that the first point is actually to take up that letter again. And so why don't we do that and then turn to the coordinating board's recommendations, and also, as I see on the agenda, the memo that I had distributed to the committee in response to the earlier, which may be out of date at this point. Woody?
Thank you, Karen. The letter, of course, was written prior to the March 17th letter from the coordinating board, prior to your response to the March 31st, and clearly prior to the actions of the coordinating board yesterday that are reflected in what was just passed out. But there's a lot of similarity with what you just mentioned, Karen, as far as the criteria, simple, long-term, at least my own views, which aren't mentioned, additional view that didn't mention in here is if you're going to try to incentivize more productivity in our higher education system through a different way of spending money, you need to really focus at the margin. And that's why my recommendation, which just glancing very quickly at the coordinating board's recommendation, it was on one measure, and that was on degrees, increase in degrees, not in degrees produced, not in percentage changes, and weighting that perhaps heavily in terms of at-risk students who would graduate, and in terms of specialized fields that the state believes that are in need, where graduates are produced. So I can tell we'll have an interesting discussion already, because I'd like to understand where the coordinating board is coming from. But my focus is a more rifle shot. How do we change behavior? How do we incentivize what we want, which I believe what we want are more degrees, and those by definition have to come because we have an increasingly at-risk population that we need access into higher education, participation, and then we need them to succeed. And so the focus, at least in my view, needs to be on that population, and needs to be also on those degrees we think that the state needs in their human capital population to be competitive. So that's what I tried to lay out. I also voiced some concerns here on the timing and on some portion of this money needs to go to build capacity, which is in line, I think, with your March 17th letter from the coordinating board. It talked about innovation. We need the capacity out there to make this a long-term plan. And other than that, I think the letter is pretty self-evident. I recommended that the community colleges need to be included. I know in the March 17th letter that they at least at this point, the way the bill is written or the writer is written, they were not included. Hopefully that can be changed. And I'll be glad to answer any questions from any of the commissioners.
Any comments or questions with regard to Mr. Hunt's points? Woody, you have talked at various times about, and it's in your letter as well, as supporting regional entities.
Yes.
Because there are clearly different priorities in different regions of the state. And I think there's a lot of sympathy for that generally going forward. Is there a way that you would propose to do that for the current fiscal year 2009 allocation as opposed to the longer term?
Right. Getting back to the comments on capacity building, that would be one area, because I mean my view is on economic development and higher education that we have an increasing need for those to be intertwined together. But that needs to be done on a more regional basis because each region of our state has different national and international competitors, and it needs an engagement of the local business and civic leadership as well as higher education on a regional basis to drive these regional, really international strategies. So I thought some of these funds could be utilized to help build the structure. We've got some examples out there in our technology fund, for example, that is operated at the state level, that has regional offices that were created with a matching of state and local dollars. Perhaps something along that line would allow some small portion of these dollars to help create regional strategic entities that could bring together regional leadership, tying economic development, international competitiveness, and higher education together. And so that was at least inferred, I think, in my letter, that some of these dollars, as we build capacity, should take the regionalization of our state, our very large state, with a whole different set of competitors based on where you are in that state, into consideration. But it's kind of a blank sheet of paper. Although we do have, once again, with our commercialization of technology and the state fund that helps support that, we do have a model that we could look to if we wanted to move in this area as far as tying higher education and economic development closer together on a regional basis.
Doing that and creating the structure for a long-term incentivization plan, it seems to me, would be desirable and feasible. Can you foresee being able to do that in time for a September 1st allocation? No.
I mean, that was when I wrote in this letter, one of my big concerns was, how do we use this initial $100 million? And, I mean, to be an incentive, it has to be forward-looking. You have to, the private industry, you call it about a line of sight. You put out a target and you incentivize an individual or a group of individuals to get there, so it has to be forward-looking. And we don't have much time for this to be forward-looking. So and we haven't, I mean, the data that needs to be gathered, the systems that need to be put in place. Now, the coordinating board could tell us that a lot of that maybe exist, but my concern was, if we're going to change behavior, you need to know before you start the game what the rules are. And I am concerned that we're in a phasing in rather than an ability to start.
Mr. Chairman, I concur with Mr. Hunt completely. This is perfect for community colleges. When you talk about a regional approach, when you talk about a collaborative between economic resources and education, it's perfect. Now, again, I want to reiterate that a collaborative approach is probably one of those things that we really need to incentivize, because it will get more of a return in terms of our investment with those incentive funds. So, for example, if in San Antonio, if Toyota and community colleges and four-year institutions have come together to do something very innovative, and it's creating and generating more students into the system and a better workforce, then obviously that's something that we want to promote.
And we need a system, Kern, I think, that it's decentralized enough that it's institutionalized decentralization that allows decisions to be made on a regional basis. Because, once again, the world's changing, as we all know. Globalization is moving forward. We need to be able to respond differently and more quickly than a centralized state system, at least in my view.
Well, was there any other comments about this particular point? No. I'm going to suggest then that we view our charge, although closely related, in two parts, and focus first on whatever we recommend to do with the fiscal year 09. And as has just been mentioned, that may be difficult to do with current data in the regionalization concept, but then set aside plenty of time to include incentivizing regional cooperation and regional goals in what we recommend going forward for 2010 on. So for 2009, if I understand it correctly, it's 2009 that the modified recommendation from the coordinating board addresses exclusively, not the going forward.
Yes, sir.
By the way, I brought, in case anyone would like to see it, the March 17th preliminary memo from the coordinating board, and which now is out of date. My memo dated March 31st was an analysis of that March 17th data, and therefore it's probably out of date as well. So why don't we turn first into what was accomplished in the last few days by the coordinating board and learn where we stand with that.
Yeah, we can. Why don't I kick it off, but she can walk through the detail. We're going to ask Susan Brown to also come up, so if anybody has any questions about how the data was produced, we'll be glad to walk you through that. What I'd like to do is try to give the task force an overview of really the actions that we took yesterday. The committee that met yesterday was the Strategic and Planning Committee, which was meeting before our board meeting next week. And there were two issues that we took up. One of those was formula funding. The others was the short term, the gap incentive funding for the academic institutions pursuant to the rider. First of all, what I'd like to do is tell the task force some key recommendations which are being made in formula funding, because as we communicated to the committee yesterday, at least for the short term, we're looking at not these in vacuums. We're looking at them as total funding for the institutions, and how do those two pieces tie in together. A couple of key changes in the formula funding. Today, as I'm sure all the task force members know, the universities and community colleges are funded based upon attempted hours, and it's measured on the 12th class day. It's however many students you have in school, that is what is the number you're funded on. A key change that we are recommending in the formula funding is that we go to a completed course measure, so that as opposed to looking at students that are just sitting in class on the 12th day, we're basically measuring young people who are in the classes at the end of the semester. That is a substantial change, as the committee knows, and the focus there is, as Woody said, is to be more outcome focused, is to focus on the end product as opposed to what's going in, looking at what's coming out. I will tell you that if you look at 08-09 data, that could make a radical change in the allocation of funding amongst some institutions. So we also are planning to recommend to the full board next week is that we do a 4-year phase-in of that, where you would look at completed students 25% and enrolled students 75%. Second year you go 50-50, et cetera. So essentially for this next biennium you would be measuring the completed students at a blended rate of about 37.5%. What we are hoping is that will help smooth out that transition for all those institutions. But again, that is a key goal there, is to be more outcome driven. The second component that we recommended is that we recommended that we put, and everybody has been calling incentive funding, success point funding. We're trying to differentiate this in the formula. We're calling this performance funding. And again, this is to be more outcome driven. And this is to carve out $100 million for the community colleges, and then to carve out $178 million for the academic institutions, which will basically be funded to the institutions based upon the number of degrees produced in any one given year. Again, focused on closing the gaps and the success side of it. So, and really, and that is not focused on at-risk or critical fields. The thought being, can we address that in the formula and then look at just at-risk and critical over in the incentive funding pool? So again, Mr. Hunt, we pulled that over where the focus has changed now to just at-risk and critical fields.
Right, and I've gone through that same process, and that's one change I would agree with, because you're narrowing the focus to where, as I've said earlier, that's really your two state goals, at-risk population, because that's where you're going to be able to close the gaps, and in those that we need technically for our employment, to be competitive on the employment.
Our idea was that the formula funding would be the platform on which incentive funding would sit. Formula funding would focus on completions across all fields, among all students, and that incentive funding would be focused on high-need fields and focus on at-risk students.
Our chairman and myself had a very brief conversation for this meeting about that this task force has a limitation in that we're just looking at the incentive piece and we're not looking at the formula funding piece, which, so I'm very glad to see that you're addressing both, because it makes it very difficult, at least in my view, for us to reach the best possible conclusions here without knowing what might take place on the formula funding.
It makes no sense that you would have the two out of alignment.
And Roberto also mentioned on the community colleges, the measure is not just degrees, but it is also transfers.
Transfers.
So it's promoting that collaboration. So it's including that measure, it's not just the number of degrees they produce, but also the transfers.
Degrees and certificates.
And certificates, too.
I have a concern there, and I don't know, and it's been a concern, not that you guys did anything erroneously, but and this has been my experience in dealing with community colleges and our experience. Our mission is so different than the four-year institutions. So, for example, just to give you an example, and I hope you've considered this in whatever you're dealing with. You have a student that comes into us, spends a year with us, feels very, very successful, and transfers without a degree into a four-year institution. You know, there needs to be some kind of provision for something like that, because at that point we will not even though we've been very successful with an at-risk student and he's moving on to a four-year institution, he has not completed with us in terms of a degree, for example. Now, he has transferred, and if you can move that into that definition, you're okay. The other thing, too, is in terms of completion, we have students that come in and take a couple of semesters, drop out, work for 2 years, come back in, and that also is something to look at. You know, how do we provide for that kind of factor in this funding? Now, I know it's getting complicated when I do that, but our population is not as static as the four-year institutions. The kids are in and out. Some come back from four-year institutions and they take summer courses, for example, and they're on our roster. Then they're considered as non-completers because they move back into the four-year institution.
Roberto, but let me. Completion is not completion of...
I understand.
Completion is just a semester course.
That's what I heard.
Okay, I mean, in other words, it's just, if they enroll at the first of the semester, did they complete the course? It's not, did they complete their full 2 years towards associate degree? And secondly, we are picking up those transfers in performance funding. So
you are?
We are.
Yes. Okay.
Because both of those it's the ones that would not be picked up would be a student that comes in a community college, halfway through the course drops out. Well, then under our proposal, they would not get formula funding for that student because we're trying to be outcome driven. We want to get them through to the end of the semester. But if they complete that semester, even if they don't go back to that community college has been funded on that student.
Good. And again, if you have that built in somehow, that will work for us because, again, that is a collaborative feature I'm advocating. If you have a student, back to the first example I gave you, which is taking 1 year with us and moving to a four-year institution, and that four-year institution takes them through to a degree, sure. Then there should be some collaborative incentive for the two entities to work together to make that happen.
We hope we've done that in this recommendation. Okay. The other thing I'll just mention on formula funding is that when you run the numbers, if you were to do this all at once, it does have some dramatic impacts on certain institutions in the state in terms of how they've historically been funded. So that is why we recommend the four-year phase-in. The other caveat to that is we also have made it, and this is a little unusual, but we ask that it be conditional upon us being able to obtain a certain level of funding for higher ed so that no one institution is going to lose funding off their base. And we're still running those numbers, but we're running those on the phase-in so we can clearly make sure that no one institution gets hurt. Now, the legislature's got to approve that, but that is the recommendation that came out of the board yesterday so that no one institution would suffer dramatically in any 1 year.
If I understood what you said correctly, this would start for fiscal year 2010, the phase-in. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did your committee consider anything about modifying your recommendation for the distribution of the 2009 funds?
Ask me that question again, Colonel.
The memo on March the 17th
Right.
was for the distribution of the $100 million for
Correct.
2009. Did your committee consider any further that recommendation, or does that recommendation still stand?
No, and that's let me talk. Let's go into that. First of all, that was, we wanted to set the context for funding, so I wanted to explain to the task force what we've done on formula funding, as that's the foundational base. The change that we have made in our recommendation for the 09 funding are two changes. In response to really a lot of the task force comments that have been made, the whole issue we heard was, how can we make it simple? We reduced the number of measures from 3 to 2. As you remember, our original proposal was absolute degrees produced, was dollar improvement in degrees, and was percentage improvement in degrees. The new recommendation, which you have before you today, addresses only absolute number of degrees produced and improvement. The thought process was twofold there. Number one is, on the absolute number of degrees, there are still institutions that are promoting substantial number of degrees which contribute to closing the gaps, and that was a key reason for still keeping the absolute number of degrees. And that has a bias towards larger institutions. We recognize that. But the second thing is, we really did want to encourage improvement, again, competing against themselves. Where are they today as their baseline, and how can they improve? And what we did is we split the money between those two, basically, is what you'll see. We're assuming that $20 million goes for top 10%. We propose $40 million to go for absolute number of degrees, $40 million to go for improvements. And that biases more the smaller schools if they're coming off a smaller base. The third change, and in our original proposal, we had $20 million allocated for innovation funds. After a lot of discussion yesterday, we voted to eliminate innovation funds in the 09 funding. And part of that is, as Woody said, this is not incentive funding. We're looking back right now. And, you know, what we're hoping is that you build a base to take the future funding. So we looked at innovation and we said, can we really get, even though that would be forward-looking, can we get substantial ideas on the table for innovation in this 09 for this funding? And we thought we probably couldn't, but that was not to say we didn't like the idea. We really like the idea long-term, because we do think that could be geared regionally, Woody, and that money could promote good ideas, you know, out-of-the-box thinking that might enhance what East Texas is doing over what South Texas is doing. So by omitting that was not saying we didn't think it was a good idea. We just thought that it was not feasible when we're looking at 09 funding. We thought that'd be a better fit. So the run you have before you today, I call it the run. We've made several of them. Basically gives you a sort by component systems to show which each institution would get, and then also one from highest award to smallest award based upon historical data.
And did you keep the same bonus weightings for 09 now, yes, for at-risk students and for needed degrees?
We made one change. We were including non-critical, non-at-risk. We took those out, and then we just weighted the other two, but we kept those weightings the same, Colonel.
Say that again, please. I'm sorry.
In our first proposal,
right,
it had looked at these measures on all degrees, and it applied the extra weighting to the at-risk and critical fields. This run does not focus on anybody but at-risk and critical fields. And we applied, you know, a weight. If you look back here, we applied there's the new proposal. If you look, at-risk students got 1 point, critical fields got 1 point, and if you were both, you got 2 points. So we did change the at-risk and critical field combination. So it went from 1 for baccalaureate degrees, 2 for at-risk, 2 for critical, 3 from at-risk student and critical field. to just 1 point for at-risk, 1 point for at-critical, and 2 points for a combination.
Okay, so that we're all understanding. Your long-term recommendation for formula funding includes a performance piece that is just the absolute number of degrees, starting in 2010.
Yes, sir.
But you're not recommending an absolute number of degrees for 2009.
Yes, no, they are.
No, we are.
You are.
We are. There's two measures. In 09, it would be total number of degrees and improvement, percentage improvement in degrees. There would be two measures.
And what you've eliminated is the increase in degrees.
Yes, sir.
The other. Now, on the percentage of degrees, if I could ask, Whit,
yes, sir.
Before you did it, you awarded money that took the $20 million and then distributed based on what quartile you were in. Did you still keep that same
We did.
formula?
Top 25% under this proposal. And it's just the way the numbers work out, Woody, but top 25% get $10,000. Next 25% gets $5,000, and then the bottom 50 get
$2,500.
$2,500. So it doubles. Bottom 50 get $2,500 per if they're in that bottom quartile. Then 5, then 10 for the top two.
So I'm sorry to be slow, but for
We've been
we've worked on this for months.
We've been sleeping with this.
for 2009, is there a weighting for at-risk and critical fields or not?
Well, you're talking about incentive funding, or you're talking about formula?
I'm talking about the $100 million that this committee is
Yes,
supposed to.
there is weighting, and this only looks at risk and critical needs. It does not focus on all the other degrees.
So that if a university graduates a student in accounting who is not an at-risk student, there is no reward whatsoever.
They
Not
get
in incentive funding. There is in formula.
formula.
No, but this committee has nothing to do with formula. It has
Yes,
$100 million for fiscal 9.
That's correct.
So you would get no incentive funding for fiscal 9 for graduating a student,
Under this proposal.
unless it was an at-risk student or unless it was a critical field student.
Correct.
That's correct.
And that's the coordinating board's recommendation
Yes.
so far. I mean, that's the
Yes.
okay. So this task force will need to decide if we agree with that recommendation or if we want to recommend that graduating a non-at-risk student in accounting is still a worthwhile thing to incentivize.
Under
Or
this
09.
proposal, yeah. We believe it's important. And unfortunately, on the other side of the formula, that's where we
Yeah, see,
look at it. Even though I know that's
I
not
can
the
say
scope of
that
this
for
committee.
010, you've put the graduation into the regular formula.
Right.
But for 09, it's not in the regular formula.
What was the logic, I guess, in extracting what to me had been the simplest calculation, which was trying to tell someone who's running an educational institution that if you increase the number of your graduates, and we'll use a 3-year rolling average, and if you can increase that 3-year rolling average from this period to the next period, you're going to get rewarded significantly per graduate, because as you narrow the number of criteria, the reward on that incremental graduate, those dollars can be relatively significant. So I was interested in the logic.
The answer is very simple. We've looked at the data for universities in Texas over the past 6 or 7 years. We have made substantial improvement in graduating more students across all fields. Where we have fallen very far behind is graduating students in high-need fields. So we thought that universities are making good progress, not as much as we would like, of course, but they're making good progress in improving graduation rates and improving the number, raising the number of graduates across the board. Where we're making very meager progress is in high-need fields like engineering. So we thought that given the fact that we're making good progress across the field, that incentive funding, it made sense to target incentive funding on those areas where we're not doing well and that are most critical to economic competitiveness.
And I don't disagree with that conclusion. What I'm really asking is the criteria to measure that, wouldn't it be simpler, and once again, sending the message to the manager on what they need to do, to simply say we're going to measure the increase in graduates that are out of that that qualify for at-risk, and we're going to measure the increase in graduates at your institution using this 3-year rolling average that are in with these special fields that our economy needs to be competitive. Why go to the percentage calculation, and why go to total graduates when why not look at the margin? What we're trying to incentivize is, because we want to pay for not the performance that we're getting today under the formula, we want to pay for improved performance, and we want to keep raising the bar. So even though you might have gone up 5% in your graduation rate, that doesn't buy you anything in the next year. You're going to have to take it up again if you want to get a bonus. So I mean, my definition of an incentive pay is you pay for doing something better than what you did yesterday. You don't get paid for what you've already done or what you're already doing without that. In other words, it's supposed to bring about a change in productivity, change in behavior, change in performance. So I agree with one conclusion. I don't understand the criteria, though, on why and whether you ran different models replicating previous history, looking at increases in graduates in those areas, and why that model wouldn't have been competitive with the one you came up with.
Well, we thought that the doing it these two different ways would accommodate both the institutions that were very large and that graduated 3 or 4 times as many students in the critical need fields as the smaller institutions did. We also wanted to make sure we didn't get caught in the anomaly of an institution going from 5 graduates in a critical need field to 15, which is a 300% increase, and receive more incentive funding than an institution that may have graduated 300 students to begin with and went to 400. In one case, you have only an increase of 10 students in absolute numbers. The other one, you have an increase that's much more dramatic, but one counts more than the other. So we thought that we would develop a method that would help both large and small institutions to compete effectively for incentive funding.
But if we're focused on the state and the regions of the state and their needs, a graduate is a graduate, no matter. And once we define the at-risk and define the special areas, where they take place, whether it's a small or small institution, or large or small, or what area of the state, that's not a criteria. I mean, it would seem to me that the criteria ought to be, what can we do on a statewide? The closing the gaps was a statewide goal to add, and we're using that as kind of the umbrella, and we're going to particular areas, as you said earlier, Raymond, that we've had our shortfall there, these special areas, right. And as we all know, the at-risk population is the other thing where we need to be able to do better in. So I like that idea. I just don't understand why we want to complicate it by taking percentages, which as soon as you take the percentage and you say, well, here we went from 5 to 15, well, now we're going to have another basis, which is the total number of graduates, so we essentially allow the small to be balanced by the large. When, if we're just talking about graduates, we don't care where they take place. We just want them to take place, and why can't we just focus on that one measure?
Okay. May I suggest that we have Susan walk us through whichever one of these tables?
And then, Woody, I want to come back to your comment.
And then we'll come back in some concrete examples.
Before Susan,
a very important point.
Before Susan does that, we had requested from the coordinating board a mock-up also of the community colleges and the health-related institutions. Do we have that today?
We have the community college one.
And for my clarity, again, are the community colleges involved in the $100 million? I know you have to respond to the writer, but are the community colleges involved in the $100 million for 09? Wayne is shaking his head yes. Thank you, sir.
Does that matter? Okay.
While we're handing that out, Ms. Roberts, just for further clarification, I assume the Legislative Budget Board and/or the governor has not yet decided exactly how much money will be in the community college pot as compared to the general academic pot. Is that?
That's absolutely correct, too.
All right. So we might make a recommendation for general academics. We might make a separate but related recommendation for community colleges and technicals, I suppose, as well.
And we would like that.
And then whether that's 80% and 20% or 70% and 30% or 90% and 10% would not be for this committee to necessarily recommend.
Right. I mean, again, it's the mechanism is perhaps most important that can be used to allocate any level of.
Get on the microphone, please.
The actual formula funding mechanism, I think, is the most important that can be used to allocate any amount of money that is ultimately determined to go to each one of the segments, whether it's universities or community colleges. But I know the governor is interested, and my guess is that the members of the Legislative Budget Board are also very interested in your recommendation as to the appropriate split of those dollars.
I would suggest then that we discuss first the allocation methodology and then come back later for the split, if that's all right. So let's focus first on the general academics, which is what we've been talking about thus far with our previous tables. And do you want us to look at page 2 of 5 or 3 of 5?
3 of 5 would be fine.
Okay.
It's just a different sort of the same number, so it doesn't really matter. Back up a little bit. I'll start with column 1, and that is the 3-year weighted average. And again, those degrees are weighted according to a 1 for critical field, a 1 for at-risk, and a 2 for at-risk students in a critical field.
And 0 for non-at-risk, non-critical field.
Correct.
Times what factor? Just a number that gets you to 40?
Yeah, take the total, divide it, it's proportionate to the 40 million.
And at-risk is defined as?
We have a lot of criteria. Let's see. Receiving a grant when they're enrolled as a first-time undergraduate at over 20, enrolled part-time, less than 12 hours within the last 10 years, received a GED instead of a high school diploma, or had a SAT or ACT score less than the national average. We use criteria for information that we already had. And this gets back to not collecting any additional information.
Okay.
And that was a Pell Grant.
It was a Pell Grant. That wasn't any grant. It was a Pell Grant, which are your lowest income students.
Okay.
And these at-risk factors, we use the federal guidelines as benchmarks.
Right.
We've used those same this whole way through. In column 2, you'll see actually multiple columns, but the first one is the increase of the 06 graduates, weighted graduates, compared to the 03 to 05 average.
This is the number of graduates.
Number of graduates.
So that if you had one additional critical field graduate, that would be 1. If you had one additional at-risk graduate, that would be 1. If you had one at-risk critical field graduate, that would be 2.
2, correct.
Compared to the average of the 3 previous years.
Right. Percentage increase.
Percentage over
It's the 06. It's taking this number compared to that 03-05 average.
Average. Okay.
We then sorted those in decreasing order by that percentage increase. The top 25 percentile was in Group 1, 25 to 50 percentile, Group 2, below the mean, Group 3.
Okay, may I interrupt there just for clarity?
Certainly.
I think you said, maybe you were about to say this, that it was $10,000 per individual or
Correct.
per unit?
Per unit. Per
For
weighted
Group 1,
graduate.
and $5,000 for 2 and $2,500 in Group 3.
Correct.
May I ask why you just didn't do a sliding scale rather than have an absolute cutoff, and suddenly if you're at the 25th percentile, you get $10,000. If you're at the 26th percentile, you get $5,000.
We could have. It was a...
Well, I'll comment. I'll tell you, one of our iterations months ago looked at a bell curve. You know, we thought, well, is that the most logical thing? But going back, Woody, to your comment, especially in this measure, we wanted to put, as opposed to just having proportional decreases, we wanted to have clear cuts for performance. So if you're in the top 25%, you get a higher reward than in the middle 25 or below. So the thought was to try to truly create, an incentive system to drive people up to those other quartiles also. So it was a reflection of those discussions around the board. So as opposed to just Kern saying, starting out and, if you're in the last 30%, you just get your proportional piece of it.
Do we have another run that does the calculation based on the increase in graduates that would have these same qualifications so that we could take and compare to the subtotal, column 1 and 2, the total amounts that add to the 80 million, and run a different schedule to see?
We've run so many, Woody, but we've got it where we can run that.
Yeah. And the data's all here, obviously.
We can put that in there and bring it back so we can look at it.
I'd be very interested to see, because my own view, and I fully understand the coordinating board, the political process, legislature, and how we want to have a lot of support, but I would also hope that we don't lock ourselves into something that doesn't accomplish the productivity that we would like to, that we could maximize out of this $80 to $100 million.
And Gary will
that's
run
my
that right
concern.
now.
And just for clarification, as an example on your page 3, a quick perusal would suggest to take 2 examples for no particular reason except that their numbers are illustrative. If you take UT Permian Basin and you take TWU is about halfway down, and UT Permian Basin is about 3/4 of the way down.
Okay.
The absolute numeric increase is 188 compared to 95. TW's almost twice as much. The percent increase is 13.9 compared to 16.6. It's fairly close to each other. TWU falls into Category 3, whereas Permian Basin falls into Category 2.
Increase number.
And consequently, TWU gets much less reward for having twice as many graduates. I think this speaks to Mr. Hunt's point. Did I interpret that correctly?
You did.
And Raymond and Whit, to me the most important thing is those presidents of the 35 or so academic institutions. Do they understand, and is it a predictable incentive to them? So when they're sitting there thinking, I'm going to start allocating resources, I'm going to go talk to my community colleges, and we'll work out a sharing arrangement with them. I'm going to try to incentivize them to send me more. I'm going to go out in my population and find who's got 2 or 3 years of college that I can get back in here. I got to spend some dollars and resources, but I know I've got to pay off if I can produce more graduates. Are they going to have enough predictability in what I see as at least a little bit more complex system that depends on 2 factors instead of 1, and also depends on where you might relatively show up? Although I do understand if you get a lot more graduates, you've only got $80 to $100 million, and if we are really successful, the amount of dollars per graduate could go down. So it's a zero-sum game in that sense. But I still think ultimately we have to ask ourselves, if the distribution comes out too much like the formula, you really haven't changed the behavior. You really haven't focused and incentivized people to come up with innovative ways to increase the number of at-risk and special field graduates. And that's really what that
is the fundamental question. I think we have. I think this system is not quite as simple as what you have recommended, and we've explained why it isn't as simple as we had originally developed it. But we've had lots of discussions with campus representatives. They certainly understand the proposal we brought forward to this task force, and I think it will be a dramatic incentive. And as I said, once again, in the context of the performance-based elements we are proposing for formula funding, I think the incentives will be very strong. I think the formula funding gets them accustomed to performance-based outcomes across the board, and I think this adds a particular emphasis that will be very clear to campuses.
What I would make in that regard is that this leaves out a very important recommendation of the coordinating board, and that is to put in performance funding for just the number of graduates. And if you increase the number of graduates, you're going to get more money.
Right.
And then on top of that, you get this. But for 2009, we don't have that first bid in.
That's true. That's certainly true.
But I want to interject something. I've just been sitting here being quiet because, frankly, this whole thing sounds like a farce to me. And I'm going to direct this question to Woody, who has been on who's been on the Board of Regents at the University of Texas. Do you really believe this formula, communicated to the regents, gets communicated to the campuses, gets communicated to the deans, gets communicated to the department heads, and affects the incentives and the performance of a teacher who ultimately decides what classes to schedule and who gets taught, at least at the major universities? How in the world does this affect that? I mean, it doesn't. I mean, I've been in the classroom 20 years. It just doesn't get down there. That's not how budgets are made. They're made from the bottom up out of historical numbers, and you add a little bit of percentage, and people fight over incremental few dollars. But I don't see how this affects the incentives that matter, which is a teacher teaching a few extra students or offering another class, because the university system has no control and very little influence over that. So I point that as a fundamental flaw in the whole way we're thinking about this.
I mean, I guess your question is, can we, put variable funding in a way that is going to affect the behavior of an institution to change its outputs?
Yeah.
And part of it is classroom, but Jeff, I don't see it all classroom. I see part of it is the whole process of attracting and retaining students, which obviously they're there to go through the classroom process, but some of the dollars can be spent in other ways. I mean, even scholarship support, jobs. I don't want to know what. I mean, that's up to the imagination of the president and the staff of each of our universities. But if you put dollars that are tied to a particular outcome, and it's understandable and predictable, we ought to get a change in outcomes. Now, does that change what happens in a classroom because they've got more students in there than they did before, because they've been successful in attracting and retaining some students they wouldn't otherwise have? You can probably better answer that question. So does it change the behavior of the teacher? Maybe not, but can it change the behavior of the institution without changing the behavior? And I'd say maybe yes.
Well, let me try to answer that question. I've been a department chair, I've been a dean, I've been a vice chancellor, and I was a faculty member for 30 years. The odds are that this will not affect faculty behavior directly. This will not get down to the level of faculty being told you've got to teach more students or you have to teach more effectively. What will happen, I would suspect, is that there will be more emphasis placed on teaching effectiveness across the institution. And the universities will devise ways to retain more students in particular disciplines and to retain students in given programs. And what will happen is that faculty will be told that teaching will become a more important criterion for advancement than it had been previously. And I suspect that the universities will put into place academic support infrastructure, more academic support infrastructure that's likely to yield better graduation rates and better retention. But if you're saying that the president will somehow communicate to faculty, this is what you must do, you're right. I don't think it'll happen.
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Faculty doesn't have to do anything to do what they want to do.
That's not true at all. That's not true at all.
Let me ask that we return to Susan and let her walk through the rest of page 3.
Okay, once we developed an amount for each institution, but depending on the group, they receive that amount per increased graduate or weighted graduate.
And that's the one labeled normalized amount?
Well, and we normalized that because we only had 40 million.
Right.
So we just normalized it, got the proportion to the 40 million. And then added the column 1 and column 2, and that gives you the final column. And this page is sorted in descending order. The page 2 is sorted by system.
Okay. And have you not yet calculated what this result of the column that's labeled subtotal, columns 1 and 2, were you able to calculate, or have you calculated yet, what % increase over the base that would represent for each institution?
No, we didn't.
that would be easy enough to do.
Yeah, we could easily do that. We just didn't do that.
The other thing I would like to, in addition to if we distributed the same amount of money just by the number of degrees increased within the areas that we've talked about.
They're running that right now.
All right, good. If they also just took the same amount of money and just increased the formula funding for all these institutions.
It would come up very different.
All right, I mean, I would like just to see those different, because at the end of the day, if it's not different, you're not maybe going to get the behavior changes that we want.
Right.
And we need to have significant difference, and you're assuming you're doing it replicated on previous experience, so you would think that there's some significant amount of difference in the productivity and increases in the different institutions. So I'd like to see what that looks like as well.
Okay.
I'm going to recommend when you do these runs also that you do calculate the percent over the current base. That's exactly what every institution is going to do. A $1 million increase to UT Austin is a very different incentive than a $1 million increase to Sul Ross State.
That's right.
And
We
you might as well save everybody the trouble of doing it themselves.
Yeah, we've actually done that
done it on
calculation.
some
We
of
just didn't put it on this form.
I think in the interest of
No, that's a very good point.
understanding what we're looking at, that would be very useful. And indeed, that was the reason for my calculation that in my response to your March the 17th. The spread was sort of meaningless until you could put it in the context of a percent increase. I would submit that the incentive for the institution, not for the classroom, but the incentive for the institution is going to be less so the dollar figure than the percent increase. If you're going to work really hard to change your admissions process or your retention process, or your don't have an incomplete grade but get to the end of the semester, or major in a critical field, or let's make a special effort to graduate the at-risk student. If the incentive gives you a 0.5% increase, you're not going to be as incentivized as if it gives you a 10% increase. So the size of the institution is very important in that regard. And the result, and I would suggest that it's just as important to incentivize our large institutions as it is to incentivize our small institutions.
My only comment on, and my only concern on the large institutions, you look at UT Austin and you look at Texas A&M College Station, they're very productive. They're our most productive colleges in terms of college graduation. They're also very large. And the only one thing my concern has been is to come up with an incentive to get them to graduate more at risk or more special fields. I think that's great to raise their graduation rate, or number of graduates. That's great. I don't want them to raise their freshman class, because they're already as big as they are, and they already take well over half of our highest performing students into those two institutions. I think from a state policy, and this is outside maybe this, but I think from a state policy, we need some of those qualified students if we're going to build other competitive public universities in other areas. So I would hope, and that was one reason I like the at-risk, and because you got fewer of those students there, and the special fields, they're going to be maybe less able to create a lot of dollars and bring in the freshman class if it's more narrowly focused there. But if what we come out here actually to be big enough to them causes them to have more freshmen, I think we made it. We're moving in the wrong direction now.
Mr. Chairman, just to change this a little bit, going back, looking at the community college sheet, there's criteria in the coordinating board's recommendation that involves awarding of certificates.
Yes.
Was that? I know it's not factored into this.
It's on for the community colleges.
Right. So when you factor that into this particular sheet, do you have that data, or?
Yes, we do. We have at risk. We also have transfers. All that is included in
this.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Roberto, you're looking at the
community college.
Community college one, and it is.
Why don't you walk us through that one real quick, too? So
okay.
It is basically the same calculation. The only difference is instead of using just undergraduate degrees, we use certificates, degrees, associate degrees awarded, and transfer students. So those were the three categories that we used. Equally across the thing.
Okay.
And so we have basically the same thing going across using the same weights. using the same definition for at-risk.
And this was really, the 100 million was just run as a proxy,
this was
just to see what institutional impact was, not knowing what dollar amount.
And let's keep this to ourselves. If the community college sees these, they're going to go nuts. I do want to specifically remind this task force that if when you look at at-risk, the at-risk area, that is generally what we deal with at the community college level. And that's where the bulk of that particular effort is going to be. And so, again, it's very important to consider that and to keep that in mind. We are already doing a lot of things programmatically, and Mr. Sandiford, something that you might be interested in is that, for example, we're doing the College Connections program in about 3 of the community college districts in the state. Very productive. We've had a 30% increase in San Antonio alone in terms of at-risk students moving into our system. Now, that needs to be incentivized. That's a good way to spend the money. There are other areas, like in the nursing field. We produce about 80% of all the nurses in the state of Texas from community colleges. If we can increase their passing rate, if we can increase the students that are moving into that field, then that needs to be incentivized. And I think we're doing a lot of that at the community college level without support. So this would be very welcome in terms of, again, changing the behavior. And I think the chairman is correct here. If we can get the institutions to start thinking differently and more community-oriented in terms of their approach, I think that it will reach the staffs. So, again, if we're looking at certificates within this is good, and I think it's a fair representation. And it will be interesting to know how much, what percentage is going to be awarded to the health-related institutions or to the academics and to the community colleges.
Are you talking about for 09 or going forward?
09 also.
I think the healths, I believe, are off the table for 09.
They are?
Yes.
Okay. Well, more for us then.
Exactly. That's why I can be the chairman.
That's right.
Let me also just clarify one further thing. In the charge, in closing the gaps originally, and also in the charge of this committee, there was the opportunity to provide incentive funding for, quote, excellence, unquote. I take it that for these recommendations, any excellence incentive funding has been omitted, at least for now. Is that correct?
Correct.
So the task force will need to consider whether we want to also omit excellence for the 09 recommendation, or even more importantly, I would submit for going forward whether we might not want to consider incorporating some excellence funding as well.
Well, in the short term, I mean, for the 09, we look to the coordinating board. I mean, they have some award systems that we could look at it as a model. I know that we won an award this year for a program that was exemplary. We've had several programs that are exemplary. If we get in a crunch or something, we might move to a more programmatic approach and then look at the coordinating board for guidance there.
Okay. Any other comments about this or questions of the coordinating board? The next thing on the printed agenda is a discussion of the memo that I sent on March 17th, which probably we've been discussing all along.
And we made some changes in response to the memo.
Exactly. The point I would make about that I tried to make in that memo, as I'm sure you appreciated, was that by weighting 2/3 of the incentive funding on relative change, whether it's absolute or percent change, it fails to recognize the outcomes, which I think most of us would regard as good at some of our leading institutions. And when we have swings between a 1% increase and a 14% increase within one system of the various components, and the perception, at least, of how well those institutions are performing, it seemed to me that we weren't necessarily incentivizing all of what we would characterize as good performance, but a too narrow segment of that. In that connection, it leads back to the issue of those institutions that are already enrolling enough students who have responded to the need for more graduates and have gotten as big as reasonably they ought to be if they're to preserve their quality. Perhaps not for 2009 so much, but for going forward. Has the coordinating board considered how you incentivize an A&M, a UT Austin, a University of Houston, or a Texas Tech? Texas Tech may still need to grow a little bit, but I believe the first three at least think they're at about the right size. How you incentivize them to avoid the current incentive in the formulas, and that is enroll more students, because that's the only way you can get more money.
Well, as we said, we took care of that through the formula funding, because the emphasis is now not simply on sheer enrollment, it's on completion, so that those institutions that will have little growth, enrollment growth, or none at all, can focus on retaining a larger share of students. Even institutions like UT Austin and Texas A&M, although they have by far the best graduation rates, they still have room for improvement.
Right. And then the absolute graduation.
Absolutely, yes.
But I was thinking specifically for 2009.
Yeah. Well, the 2009 incentive funding does include a component for absolute growth and for percentage growth, and once again, by focusing on what those institutions have done in terms of improving retention, they would benefit. But once again, the problem that you're addressing is, and Bob Shepard has talked about this, for 2009 is a one-year program that's, in one way, you could characterize this not as incentive funding, but bonus funding.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what, and there's really no easy way to address that issue.
Well, and I guess my question is, should we give a bonus only to, or preferentially to those institutions that started low and raised themselves, as opposed to those that were already performing very well indeed?
I think that's why we use the absolute number of degrees, because for the larger institutions, that first column is a bias towards that large institution. So it was a counterbalance, I guess, the way we looked at it, is that we were rewarding the UTs and the A&Ms for still producing a certain number of degrees.
That leads me to ask the question, how much was your formula recommendations, are they driven by the concept that it is a bonus? And I call it a 13-month paycheck. In other words, it's not going to change the behavior, because it essentially happens, and it's based on how well you did, but your behavior really wasn't influenced because it was so late to be able to do that. So, I mean, how much of, if we're trying to design a 10-year plan that's all going to be forward-looking, line of sight, you make these changes, you get this reward, you don't get the reward. So is the 1 year dominating the design, how to deal with 09, or if we're looking at over the next 10 years, would you have come to a different conclusion or a different recommendation?
Well, I think that what we propose works better over the long run than it does over the short run, for precisely the reasons that Curran indicated. I think it does make better sense over a 10-year span than it does as a one-year scheme for incentive funding.
I think also, Woody, in response to that, the one part that's missing is the innovation piece that we did take out. So I think that, if somebody came back to the coordinating board and said, is this a good foundational piece for a 10-year plan, we'd say, yes, we believe it is, and we're also saying that in light of formula funding recommendations, but also that we would add back in that innovation funding to create a fund there to create regional competitiveness and all those issues that we've been talking about.
And the capacity building that you referred to.
I think that, but we did look at as hopefully a foundational base to build a long-term plan as opposed to just a short-term fix for this year.
Yeah, because your March 17th did have 20% of the money in that area.
Right.
My comment about that would be, given, again, page 3 in the handout, an institution such as UT Dallas, which is a young institution and is growing, ranks actually third in what it would achieve in terms of absolute dollars, and given their base, probably a very high percentage increase as well. That over 5 years, this might be a very good incentive for them to continue to graduate more critical need fields and at-risk students. But that institution, in its maturity, 10 years from now, will reach a point that it should not be enrolling more students. And let's be very candid about this. The easiest way to get more at-risk graduates and critical field graduates is to enroll more students. Retention helps. All of those things after they're enrolled helps, but it's a lot easier to just enroll more students, and we already have an incentive for doing that. And UT Dallas will enroll more students. It's in a growing area. It needs to grow. It wants to grow. But at some point, like A&M, like UT Austin, it will reach a size in which they should not be incentivized to keep on growing. And I'm wondering if this really is the best tenure plan, because it every year says grow more this year, grow more this year, grow more this year, without a feature for maintaining excellence and quality.
Kurt, let me respond to that. I think that if you look at the data, I don't know that we've ever broken out the data on a statewide basis, but I would guess that the data in Texas are not terribly different from the national data. We know at a national level that approximately 19% of students who declare STEM, one of the STEM fields is their major, ultimately graduate in those disciplines. Now, they graduate. I'm saying 19% of the people who ultimately graduate, who declared STEM as their initial major, actually graduate in that field. So there is a huge opportunity to retain those students in those fields and graduate them in those fields without increasing enrollment, because you're losing 80% of the students in those areas across the board. So I would think that some enterprising institution might do a cost analysis of this and say, cost-benefit analysis, and say it makes more sense to focus on retaining the students than it does on going out and recruiting and enrolling at-risk students in these disciplines.
I agree entirely. My point is that as you succeed in doing that year after year after year, at some point you plateau.
Given how little success we've had nationally in increasing dramatically the numbers of at-risk students in high-need fields, there's been a growth of somewhere in the range of 1-2% every 2 or 3 years for 30 years. So it's going to be a long time before we have to revisit this issue, because campuses have plateaued. I would love to have that problem.
I mean, your point, I think, is that these institutions can level off in size, but what's happening internally in terms of at-risk, and we know that the supply side is increasingly at risk.
Precisely.
Right? And we also know from the employment side we need more. And so this is really more of a laser shot, rifle shot, to trying to deal with those two specific issues. And an institution could be the same size and have a dramatic different result as far as the incentive dollars because of those two factors.
That's correct.
By its very nature, it should fluctuate. It's an earned bonus or award. So it may change from year to year. And, taking a little departure from discussion of the base, this shouldn't be perceived as an addition to the base. It should be something that people really work for to get. So, again, the issue is it will fluctuate regardless of your enrollment, even if you're growing or not growing. If you're growing just because you're sitting there static and not really recruiting well, you're not going to get the incentive. But if you're growing and you're real dynamic and you're trying to recruit at-risk populations or the STEM populations, then you're eligible for the award.
Let me respectfully disagree from the standpoint of a university administrator. The reward that we're striving for and that we want to strive for continually, not just for 1 year and then lose it.
Right.
will be spent primarily on salaries, will be spent primarily on faculty. And the long-term predictable rewards need to be aligned with what will allow us to recruit and retain the best faculty. If there is fluctuation because we've done really well and then we can't do any better, and you lose money as a result of that because you can't keep on growing or improving at the same rate, there will be a tremendous reluctance on the part of the universities to recruit a faculty member when 2 years from now you may well not have the money to pay that faculty member's salary.
Are you speaking of recruiting tenured faculty or teaching faculty?
I'm talking about recruiting faculty to teach the students. And I would suggest that we need to make sure that when we offer positions to people, that if we continue to do as good a job as we've been doing, we don't find that the funds have diminished because all we have done is continue to do an excellent job. And if we do, we're going to have a hard time persuading the best faculty to come, especially tenured faculty, especially the faculty who can bring research grants and who can build the excellence of the institutions.
Well, I just bring that up because 70% of the faculty in the United States in four-year institutions are now part-time faculty. They're not tenure or tenure-track faculty. And so the people that are teaching our students are not tenured faculty, and if you look at the amount of time spent teaching, including advising and anything connected with teaching, tenure and tenure-track faculty spend less than 25% of their time doing that. So I would argue that if we want to teach better, we find a way to actually pay the people that are doing the teaching as opposed to make long-term deals with people who aren't doing the teaching. So I just would respectfully say this idea that we need to spend a lot of money recruiting tenured faculty who at least on average in the United States do only spend 25% or less of their time teaching, that doesn't solve the problem of teaching people.
Who's empowered to tweak the rules as time goes by? Is that the coordinating board?
Tweak what rules?
Tweak the whatever, if something changes significantly, who are we going to reconvene this task force? Or?
Well, it depends on what the issues are. There's some, for example, incentive funding was mandated by the legislature this last session, and there was a particular process identified for this issue. It may well be that down the road another legislative mandate will require a similar or even a different process. There are some things that exist in coordinating board rules and regulations, but it depends on what the issue is, and it depends on the implementation of the issue.
Because we're spending a lot of time, looking out 5, 10 years, and I imagine this thing is tweakable as time goes by if something gets out of whack.
Well, it's part of the responsibility of the coordinating board to monitor academic success and how we're doing in terms of achieving the goals of closing the gaps, and it's within our purview to recommend shifts in strategy or shifts in policy or shifts in changes in regulation if we think that they're called for. So certainly we would be taking a look at the way incentive funding is working, whatever this task force recommends, and we would recommend to the appropriate people what those changes might be when we get to that point.
The history of formulas in Texas, which now dates back over 40 years, is that the basic structure is slow to change, and the details are slow to change, and the changes are modest at best. So I think it behooves us to try to get it right the first time, because if we get it not quite right, the likelihood that it will quickly be rectified, or even rectified 5, 10 years later when circumstances have changed.
Well, Bernie did use the term tweaking.
is modest.
Yeah.
I could see the outcome. I mean, it's interesting to listen from, because Kern has got a different background than I've got, or Jeff's got. I mean, so we've got an academic, leader, a very distinguished one by that way, some business people, different experiences in their organizations, different experiences how they incentivize people. And so, I mean, I look at it as, I don't really care where this production is coming from or these other graduates. I just know it has to take place, and we need to be able to deliver the dollars to those that can deliver on that promise. If that means that certain institutions aren't growing anymore or aren't going to participate, at least from a state policy standpoint, that doesn't bother me, because because some places they might have, the population might not be growing, or for whatever the reason, they're not going to be successful, and they are incentivized by this program. But as a state, we know that we have to be successful here if we're going to stay competitive as a state. So, I'm looking at it at one level, and Kern, you've got your hat on as an administrator with a lot of experience that a lot of the rest of us don't have. So it's, and that's probably why we have a diverse, group of people here that are coming together trying to come to a recommendation. I find it interesting.
There is one other incentive recommendations that has appeared under a different label, and it came from the coordinating board committee that recommends formulas, and it's called success funding. I think this is a standing committee that meets every 2 years and recommends
Formula Advisory Committees. Yes.
Formula Advisory Committee. I received a communication from Ms. Potter, who summarizes these things for the Association of Colleges and Universities, on what that committee recommended, including a new recommendation for what they call success funding. And interestingly enough, I'll pass that out for the members of the committee. This date's just from a few days ago. And if you plow through this, you get to a part that, so there's a very complicated formula page that looks like this.
Copies.
I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon? That's a subset of this. This is the one you want here. I think. You got it enough? Is this the kind you have?
Yes, we have enough.
Sorry. So somebody got the wrong piece of paper, sorry. If you go through, there's a rather complicated formula. If you extract from that formula the part that was labeled success funding option 1,
Where are you?
Yeah,
I'll read what's quoted in here somewhere. That the decision for success formula funding, it's on the second page, success components decision.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Utilize 100% of the success 1 number of degrees option with $100 million applied to undergraduate and graduate awards. Regarding weights, the recommendation for undergraduate awards was 1.25 for at-risk students or critical fields, and 1.5 if a graduate is both at-risk and a critical field. Implication being is 1.0 if it's just an ordinary student. And the graduate degrees were recommended also at a weight of 1.0 unless the degree was awarded in a critical field. So the Formula Advisory Committee independently has come up with what I think we would have defined as an incentive formula based on graduation, including weightings for at-risk and critical fields. Their weights were different than what the Strategic Planning Committee did. That's not to say they're worse or better. But I analyzed these when I received these a few days ago the same way that I did the original coordinating board recommendation. And we'll pass these out to, this is just summarizes what's in the more complicated formulas here. And in contrast to the earlier March 17th memo, which had a range of 0.4% increase to, I think it was 13.6% for some institutions, using a slightly different base because it was in the institutional and operational expense plus teaching supplement rather than the total GR, and using $100 million rather than the $60 million. Nevertheless, the average overall was a 3% success formula, and the range was a much narrower range from about 1.2% to about 5.7%. So the faculty advisory committee or the institutional advisories committee have been looking at the same sort of thing, and I know more about this than what I've just shared with you. But I thought it would be useful to let you know what another committee, not charged with incentive funding, but charged with formula funding specifically, had independently decided to recommend. And again, the graduations weighted for at-risk students and weighted for critical fields were the three things that they came up with. They also included graduate degrees. This particular committee was not concerned with community colleges, so they obviously did not recommend that. It was not concerned with health institutions, so they made no recommendation about that either. So I did want to share with the committee this new information, which I just came across, and so I don't know whether Ray or Susan, you might want to comment on this at all.
Well, let me, we took a look at these recommendations very carefully and ultimately decided to do something a bit different. They wanted these components to be placed on top of a certain level of base funding. And what we did was we took most of these recommendations. We didn't use the at-risk formulations and so forth, but we took the concept of focusing on actual student success, and we decided that we should build this into the formula as part of the base, not on top of the base, so that our total amount of funding was very similar to what the Formula Advisory Committee recommended, but that most of these factors would be part of the way the base was determined. They wanted a higher base with these incentive-based programs on top of that, and we said no, we want to put them into the base as part of consideration in determining how much money individual institutions would get.
So that was then, in effect, you modified the recommendation and came up with what you said was the second component of $100 million for performance funding based on numbers of degrees.
Right.
Correct. That's correct. That was the two basic differences.
Okay. Does the committee have any questions about this? It is now 2:30. There are some of the members of the committee who would like to leave at 3. We have covered the agenda in terms of sharing information. What we have not done is arrive at a recommendation, and I'm not sure whether the committee wants to begin that effort today or wants to digest some of the information that we have. And I throw the meeting open for comments about what our next step should be and when we should take that next step.
I would certainly, Mr. Chairman, like to see what I requested earlier before coming to a conclusion on if we just focused on one criteria being the number of graduates, using everything else being the same. How would that compare? And I know that's being worked on. And then also, if we just added this to formula funding for that same period, how would it have distributed the dollars? So that gives us some reference points of
Impact on change.
Impact of change, what are we really incentivizing? Obviously, from my perspective, the wider the disparity is telling me I'm sending a message there to incentivize, and the narrower it's more business as usual. So I just like to see those differences. And I know, as I said earlier, there's political realities of how we ultimately are able to get the legislature to sign on, support this long term, and we can't ignore that, but I don't want that also to influence us in a way that we end up with something, as Kern was saying, that we only get partly right.
So you're recommending that we get some more data before we start to decide amongst the various options that we have, and specifically you would like to see a run, and the coordinating board presumably can do this, not overnight, but before the next meeting for sure.
Oh,
yeah.
absolutely.
We won't have it today.
On the
We will have one of them today. We will have it by increase.
But we won't have.
But we won't have the
analyzed it
formula run.
today.
Right, yeah.
But you can get it to us before the next.
Oh, easily.
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 Okay.
Well, we should have in the next 5 minutes.
But let's clarify. You're interested in the incremental increase in the number of graduates.
If we use the same time period here, did everything else the same, but we exclude the two criteria the coordinating board is recommending and use that singular criteria.
All right, now, do you want the number of graduates
In the at-risk, everything else being the same.
in the at-risk and critical fields?
Right.
We've
Everything
got
else
that
is
part
the same.
done. We're adding the part where it shows what percent of the 0809 that it is.
And Susan, we're running that on just an $80 million pool, right?
Right.
Okay. That's what.
Well, it might be useful for us to get all the data. It would be the total number of graduates in the base period, the total number of graduates in the most recent year, the number of at-risk graduates in the base period and the most recent year, and the percent increase, the number of critical field graduates in the base period, so that we can see all of the raw data.
Mr. Chairman, would that also include the community colleges in that scan?
And it could also
Add the certificates, too. That would be.
No problem. They're in there.
Good.
But what you're saying, Kern, I think, is you want to see a breakout of that data by institution as opposed to it just being included in the roll-up.
Right.
So, the spreadsheet showing.
So what I'm hearing is that Mr. Hunt, for one, is more interested in the absolute increase. Some others might be more interested in the percent increase. Some others might be interested in the total number of graduates. I'm now talking about for 2009, but separately for going forward as well.
And you can see the way that things are splitting up why we did it the way we did.
But that data is all there, and you can pick and choose, and ultimately the committee will want to be able to know how to pick, how most wisely to pick and choose.
If you would, if you're willing to take a 5-minute break, I can go make sure that we accelerate things.
That'd be great.
We could at least have the
that
run
would be
for
fine.
Woody.
Yes,
Yeah.
we can have that one.
Woody's run that
But
we're
I think
working
what
on.
would be best
Be
would
on the
be
way.
if all of that data gets sent to us as a package.
Let me go see where we are with Woody's data.
But I would kind of agree with Woody. I'd like to see all the new data, digest it, and really try to maybe zero in on something at the next meeting.
Right. I think, giving us a chance to read it carefully, and I know you've been under time pressure. You just made your decision yesterday at the coordinating board, which prevented getting us the data. But I think for us to do our job, we need to spend some time not only getting more data, but reading everything that you've given us so far very carefully.
Let me make a statement, which and invite people to add to it. I believe that there has been a general consensus that we want to look at graduations, especially of at-risk and critical fields. There may be some difference of opinion about how you weight the absolute number of graduations versus the percentage increase versus the absolute increase, and we can discuss that. For 2009, I've heard no discussions of trying to put into that any element of, for lack of a better word, excellence, because we can't get there quick enough. We may want to do that, however, 2010 and beyond. There has been some sentiment Jeff, I'm looking at you especially here, that it would be good if we could somehow link whatever we incentivize to classroom performance. But how to do that with the numbers available to us in 2009, I haven't heard a suggestion yet, and I would wonder if you could maybe make some suggestions before our next meeting.
Yes, sir. Be happy to. Thank you.
And Kern, I would like the task force to at least continue to consider some of the, because I think we also maybe have a consensus that 2009 is more that 13-month paycheck,
Right.
which to me would indicate that perhaps some of the dollars ought to go for the, what do you call it, innovation, capacity building, trying to and whether we did it by just lump sum awards under some formula, or whether, as you proposed in your March 17th, where it's a competitive process of making proposals to the coordinating board, trying to get institutions to come up with, here's some ideas on how we can spend and do a better job and be more competitive. Now, maybe that doesn't work. This regionalization concept, what would we do if we funded a regional approach? I mean, some dollars in that area, because it is a 13-month, the research piece, the innovation, the capacity building, I'd like to at least keep on the discussion.
I think we definitely need to keep it on the discussion for 2010 and beyond. Whether we can figure out a way to do it for 2009 will be more difficult. But in that regard, that was the next thing I was going to bring up, in fact. Part of our charge is to propose incentive funding to meet statewide and regional needs. That's in our charge. Before you can decide how to meet regional needs, you need to define what the regions are. Does the coordinating board
We have 10.
have regions?
Yes, we
And
do.
could you provide that
give you
information for
yes.
us, please? And which institutions fall into which
We have
regions?
that.
I'd like to add to what Mr. Hunt talked about in terms of finding programs that are worth incentivizing and also that promote competition and performance. Again, I want to tout the coordinating board has already got a pretty neat structure in terms of determining what are some of the exemplary programs in the state. So if we get to that point where we need to look at some lump sum awards or something like that, I think the criteria is already there. All we have to do is go to the tweaking factory here at the the board and see if they can provide us that criteria. I know that is a process that becomes very competitive for us at the community college level. The last session I went to was in Houston, I believe, and everybody was on pins and needles. It seemed like the Oscar was about to be awarded. So there is a lot of credibility, a lot of integrity in that process, and maybe we can use that as a basis.
For the community colleges and the technical institutions, which I assume would also be included in this, and I'm going to turn to Roberto about this specifically, are the factors that we've outlined the right ones, or are there others that should be considered? And that is transfers, associate degrees, certificates, and seems like there was a fourth one.
Well, we're still in the critical fields. I mean, yeah.
Fields and at risk.
Yeah,
But-
and at risk.
Yes.
Yes, sir. And your answer is yes.
Transfers, certificates, and associate degrees. And is that also true for technical colleges? Or
Yes,
Same three?
same thing.
Was there semester completions?
That's part of the formula
That's
fund.
part of the regular
Okay,
fund.
okay.
Now, we then need to consider, not for 2009, but for 2010 beyond, the health institutions.
Yes, sir.
Where most people tend to think of medical schools and dental schools as the health institutions, and their graduation rates approach 100%. Sometimes it takes 5 years instead of 4, but if you just count the number of graduations, it's going to be between 95, certainly greater than 90%. That's not necessarily true in the allied health field or the nursing field so much. It's also a factor in the health institutions that with nursing and with allied health, you're not having to provide the infrastructure for English classes and history classes and all the things that lead up. You're really catching them in the junior year at the earliest, and sometimes only at the master's degree level. So I don't know that today is the day to do it, but we're going to need to consider as a committee what incentive or performance or outcome measures we adopt for the health
It just didn't
institutions
get changed yet.
that are graduation related. Now, clearly, the health fields are all STEM fields, so 100% is that. The at-risk students are a little harder to define because they're not coming out of high school. They're all over 20 years old. They're not part-time, or very few of them are part-time, so the definitions don't really fit.
Correct.
Unless you want to go back 4 or 8 or 10 years ago where the data aren't available. So we do have minority status. Underrepresented minorities could be counted if that were a desirable analog to at-risk students. We do have the ability to look at test of licensure scores so that passing on the first time might be rewarded as opposed to graduation rate. We also have the very important area of post-MD or DO or DDS education, and that is residency training and board certification in those specialties, for which I would suggest we need to incentivize our institutions to have more residency completers, those being the people most likely to practice medicine in Texas. And then there's a research arena that could be considered as well. There is a research incentive program. In fact, there are 2 research incentive programs. Texas Tech, A&M, University of Houston, and UT Austin get one set of research incentives that, as a percentage of their research productivity, is a different percentage than all of the other campuses, and I'm not sure whether Prairie View which one Prairie View falls in. And the health institutions have yet a different research incentive program, which is much smaller than either of those 2. And I believe it would be a legitimate consideration for this committee to recommend, certainly not for 2009, but for 2010 going forward, some sort of carefully thought through and consistent research incentive program. Because we've now got 3 different ones that, in many regards, are very arbitrary.
Right.
You know, how do we open the door wider for the at-risk and the at-risk students to come into your institutions? I mean, you catch what you're pitched, right? So how do you do that?
Well, and we catch what we're pitched collectively, and then we compete individually for that same pool of students.
Exactly.
And we compete, frankly, against Harvard and Duke and Johns Hopkins and California and all the other
tough situation
institutions as well.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the graduation rate for the at-risk student, which we don't measure, but we do measure the underrepresented minorities, the Hispanics and African Americans, the graduation rate is slightly smaller than for the non-underrepresented students, but it is very slight, as in 96% as compared to 97.5% or something like that. It's a very modest difference. There is some difference in terms of the numbers of underrepresented minorities who take 5 years to graduate instead of 4 compared to the non-minorities. But it's very small.
Yeah, but with the at-risk population increasing, as you know, in Texas as we go forward, I guess you're going to have to change something. You're going to have to change something. I don't know what that something is, but
and the something starts in grade school and goes through middle school and high school and college and professional school.
So you're pretty. There's nothing that you can do to increase the flow.
Well, there are things we can do and do try to do that is not just after they come to us, but in terms of going to colleges, going to high schools, and going to middle schools to help those institutions prepare students for health careers. So we do have a lot of outreach programs, and if we develop a relationship with those teachers and those students, then maybe they're more likely to come to the institutions that have performed that outreach service.
So maybe we could incent the outreach component of what you do.
The outreach component is not an outcome, however, and we're charged with outcome measures.
Okay.
I think if we do the outreach well, in time, the outcome measure will rise. In fact, it has, but not to the degree we want. In 1992, this was a bigger problem even than it is now. The Health Institution Advisory Committee recommended that there be, if I remember correctly, it was either 10 or I think a 15% bonus, if you will, for graduating a student who was from an underrepresented minority. Now, if you take just the annual appropriation amount for a medical student, which is about $50,000, a 15% bonus is not trivial. And it certainly will pay for the extra tutoring and mentoring and encouragement and outreach that results in a student graduating that might otherwise flunk out or drop out. So,
But you said your graduation rate is almost 100%, and that includes at risk and anybody who shows up at the door.
That's right.
So,
right. For medical school and dental school, it's less so for nursing and health.
Okay.
So it is a tough one.
Yeah.
I don't have a ready answer. The easier incentivization program for the health institutions is on the research side, frankly, and I would say allied health and nursing than it is in the medical schools and dental schools. So I'm going to suggest, if I hear nothing else, that we wait for more data.
Okay.
We formulate our thoughts.
What was handed out?
Yeah, you want to walk us through that?
It shows 40 million, but
It really is 80 million.
right.
Yeah.
The number at the bottom just didn't get changed.
Right.
But it is 80 million, and this is normalized just strictly on increase.
And it would be interesting, Susan, if you could lay these side by
Right.
side
Right.
and do a comparative analysis, just so we can look at the difference in institutions.
Right,
It'd
and
be
then
easier.
that other column on the formula funding, so in other words, you'd had them
That-
all
yes,
laid
that
out, and
one
we
will
could begin to
take-
see,
yes.
are we,
And
our
I just want-
criteria driving change.
I just want to make sure, Kearney, you have the other factors, the raw data that
Yes, we have all that.
the chairman requested, the number of graduates,
Let's
the number at
Number of graduates, the number at risk, those in critical fields at risk, the raw, and then the
Yeah,
weights.
and number and the increase, so we can
Right.
see that raw data.
Increase and percentage increase. And
For the numeric increase, did you also divide those into categories 1, 2, and 3?
not in this run.
Not in this run.
I was assuming you didn't want it in this run? Or would you like to see
And
it?
all
in
the data, the better, I mean, from my perspective.
So with these,
Speaking for myself, on the face of it, these dramatic differences of going from 10,000 to 5,000, if you've got one more or one fewer student, is not as appealing to me as doing it purely on the numbers and letting the chips fall where they may, rather than having an arbitrary cutoff. You could get very different numbers if you said the top third, the second third, and the bottom third than if you said the top quarter, the second quarter, and the
Or
bottom
change
half.
the bonuses at the
Or
different.
yeah, exactly. Or changed it from 10,000 to 7,500. So I think it might make more sense to say, let's have a number either for percentage increase or for absolute increase and go with it rather than a categorization. That's just my opinion, but something for us all to individually consider.
Earlier with our task force last fall, we did run some numbers that were based mostly on percentage increase, and you got X amount on the percentage increase, as Mr. Ryder said, with the bell curve. You get some unusual things when you do it that way. You get institutions that have had large percentage increases that actually get a lot more money even though they've graduated a lot fewer students. So you get some very unusual things.
if you're using a percentage.
if you just use it
Right.
on the percentage.
Yeah.
So you get, which is one of the reasons we got into that grouping, and then the same amount within the group per
Well,
graduate.
But on the, if you did a different amount per graduate in the absolute numbers, for example, if the 50th percentile happened to fit between West Texas A&M and Tarleton State, the difference between 155 and 152 is a very small number. If you multiplied it by a very different factor, you get very wide differences. Well, this is very useful. Thank you. All right, next, Mr. Roberts, would you like to come forward? And Wayne.
Excuse me, I was involved in a heavy philosophical.
Do you want to tell us when we meet next?
Yes, sir. We have tentatively scheduled May the 7th, 1 o'clock, presumably here, though that's still to be settled.
Okay.
And after that, May the 19th.
Okay. Well, what is the committee's wish? Would you like to individually submit to the rest, to all one another, your thoughts about what, at least tentatively, you would favor as what we should focus on for, I'm going to suggest, for the 2009 issue? And try to reach resolution on that on May the 7th?
You want a recommendation
A
prior to May
recommendation.
7th to you?
Yes. And which will go to all of us.
Right, understand.
Would we channel those to Wayne, or, because I don't have a lot of y'all's
Yes, no,
email?
if it goes to Wayne, Wayne will get it to all of
All right.
us.
And what, you want to put a date on that so that you've got time to?
Sure. What would you suggest? This is the 16th, working backwards from the 7th,
You gave us 2 weeks, that would get us to April 30th?
and that would be 1 week before
Or Friday the 2nd.
Friday the 2nd. That would be good. How about Friday the 2nd?
We will need those packets quick.
Yeah. There we go.
Okay.
Well, Friday the 2nd may not give us time, really. Let's try to do it. What is the 7th is what day?
The 7th is Wednesday.
Let's have them the Wednesday before.
Should be the 30th.
That is
Should be
the
the
30th.
30th.
Yeah.
Kern, if we meet here, and I don't know if that's where you want to meet, but if you do, what we might do, Susan, is like we did in the committee meeting, have screen hooked up, or we can have Excel there. So if we want to tweak it and say, what if we do this? We can do some what ifs
Good.
and do it right here. We can look live at the screen and see
That'd
what
be
the
good.
financial impact might be.
And my prediction is we better plan to stay at least through 4 o'clock.
Yes, sir.
Very good.
Commissioner, thank you for your facilities. Wonderful.
Well, we're always delighted to have distinguished visitors.
Before we adjourn, is there anybody in the audience who would like to make any comments? If you do have any suggestions or comments or observations, if you'd submit them to Wayne Roberts, he will be sure that the task force receives them.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. We're adjourned.
Thank you. Good meeting.
It's never simple.
Coming on the 21st.
One sentence.
Head toward having to make a decision.